Thanks for joining us Behind the Frontline, a podcast providing timeless solutions to everyday workforce and workplace challenges. Frontline Training Solutions is an express employment professionals company, strategically placed between the workplace and the workforce with professionals standing by, ready to combat your unique challenges. Learn more about what we do at frontlineon.com. Well, hello again, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Frontline with Frontline Training Solutions. And my name is Nic Dampier, and I'm the creative director here. And I'm joined once again in the studio with Jimmy Nelson, who is our Director of Leadership and Organizational Development here at Frontline. Say hi, Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy. And hi.
And of course, you may know him, but he is Nathan Leaman, President of Frontline Training Solutions.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here with you guys, too.
All right. So today, we are diving a little deeper into a webinar topic that we had recently at Frontline, and that was building a stronger culture, where Jimmy actually walked us through some culture, organizational best practices. But we actually did a podcast back in November of 2024 called Best Practices for a Strong Organizational Culture. So after that conversation and the webinar, it'd be good to keep talking about this. It seems like there's a lot left unsaid.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Jimmy, I'd love it, and I think our audience would love it, if you would just walk us through some of the webinar, just give a brief overview of it.
Sure. Well, a couple of main things that we talked about. First of all, a mission statement, understanding what your company mission statement is, because if you as a leader don't know what the mission statement is, I guarantee you the people below you don't. And when you're making decisions and when you're trying to change culture in an organization, or even just identify culture in an organization, knowing what your mission is, know what the company mission statement is, critically important. Second piece we talked about was core values and how important they are to have, and making sure that the core values that are written up on the wall are the same core values you're spending time doing in your manufacturing plant or your facility, office or otherwise. And one of the important things is that we talked about in the webinar with that is having definitions so that everybody knows what the words mean. Because I did a little thing where I said, what comes to mind when you say the word jar? Well, a whole bunch of different things. And so if a word like jar is hard to define, how am I going to define transparency or integrity or one of those words? So understanding what the definition of the core value words are, I think, is critically important. And then the final thing is taking every opportunity that you can, whether it's in a meeting, whether it's in a one-to-one conversation or whatever, to reinforce those things, to talk about the mission, tell the story of the company, tell the story of why the mission's important. And the same thing for values, behaving through those values. It's that walk the talk stuff we used to talk about. But even more important than that, purposely behaving in a way that demonstrates that and models that for everybody else, especially if you're in a leadership role. But even if you're not, even if you're a regular hourly employee doing your work and this is what you do, actually understanding that that's the values I need to be looking at, behaving like every day. And that's what really changes organizational culture when you can get it to that level.
Yeah. So what inspired you, and maybe Nathan, this is a question for you too, what inspired you to dig into the topic of aligning core values in the first place? Why is that important to Frontline?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And the reason it's a good question is because nobody asks it. And I think that's the reason why. When I go into organizations and do an assessment of the culture or look at how people are performing or if there's conflict going on or whatever, the first thing I reflect on is, what are they doing with their core values and what are they doing with their mission statement? And I tell this story a lot when I do leadership training. Especially if it's on site at a company, I put the mission statement up on a PowerPoint and cover it with a black slide. And then I say, I'll give anybody $20 in the room if you can tell me what your mission statement is word for word. And over 20 years, I have not paid anyone yet. And so, that tells you something, that there's a need there. And I think oftentimes you just don't realize it. You don't see it. And so having, focusing on an area where people kind of, it's underneath the ground, you don't really pay attention to it and bring it to the surface, I think it makes a huge difference in organizational culture. And that's why I like to focus on it.
Yeah. When you think about, connecting with companies and talk about their training needs or their consulting needs or their coaching needs, kind of what Frontline offers, it's really important to understand what they believe and what they say about what they believe. And because they're asking us, hey, can you help our leaders be better leaders, which is a very ambiguous thing to ask. And so we have a million questions around what that means. Or can you help us with trust? Or can you help us with communication? And knowing how they think about that, have they taken the time to define it, and how is it embedded into the organization? You know, I've been hearing a lot lately that the phrase clarity is kindness.
Yeah.
And so the more you're clear on what it is you're expecting of employees, the easier it is for them to actually deliver that.
Mhm.
And so we're going to ask some questions to get at the root of, well, who are you as an organization? What are you expecting? How are you communicating that expectation? Because we can come in with all sorts of great training tools, resources, experiences, get people fired up. But once we leave and the pomp and circumstance goes away, the Jimmy show turns off, what's going to happen then?
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll work with organizations. Maybe they haven't taken a lot of time. Well, let's talk about that too,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of lay that out for the organization. But if they have, then let's build off of that, because that's being embedded in the organization. They're going to see that way more than they're going to hear from us.
Mhm.
So that's, I think, part of why culture is so important for us to look at.
That's great. Yeah, I would like to see Jimmy ask that question to our team to see how many people can recite our mission statement.
Yeah,
absolutely.
potentially.
Yeah.
I have a feeling you may not give away a lot of money either.
Probably still on a good record.
He's working on it.
Yeah.
So why do you both think that so many organizations struggle to define or live out their core values?
Yeah, I would jump in and say, I think more organizations struggle to live it out than define it, because I think a lot of companies have done the work.
Yeah.
We're not running into a lot of companies that don't have any values or any core competencies or behavioral expectations, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
Something to define who they want the organization to be and how they want the organization to act. I think the bigger challenge is the consistency. And I guess one thing I would just offer, it's not the entire answer to the question, but part of it is that leaders themselves have not really figured out how to exhibit it. If an organization is struggling with living out their culture, I'm looking at leaders.
Yeah.
That's where I'm going first. Are they exhibiting it? Are they demonstrating it? And it kind of, it reminds me a little bit, I guess, of my approach in the past, as, been in multiple HR roles, and people come in and say, Nate, we got to get rid of this person. They're just not doing a good job. My first question was never about them, meaning the individual that's underperforming. My question was always, what have you as a leader been doing to coach, manage, perform, help them see and understand goals, all that stuff. And I think the same applies when it comes to values and culture as well. Mm-hmm. Is what have our leaders been exhibiting that is either supposed to be reinforcing or actually creating a different culture.
Correct.
Because, when we talk about culture in some of our training class, especially our HR classes, we put up a picture of an iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
There's what you say the culture is and what people see, nice plaques on the wall and those kind of things. And then there's everything that's under the surface that's not defined and not clear for people. And so sometimes leaders are actually fostering that below the surface iceberg part of the culture that is not helping in long term. And so I want to get there if I can.
Yeah.
So that would be an idea of why it's hard.
And you have to realize too that the way that the leader is behaving came from a model. Mm-hmm. So it's the way the previous leader taught me, either the same or the opposite. I mean, they're always going to look at, well, that's what success looks like. He's my boss. That's what success looked like. I need to work in that way. So no matter what they write up on the wall or what they put out as core values and behaviors or competencies I'm supposed to hold, it's always going to be, that's what good looks like. I want to be that guy someday. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to model his behavior. So that's why when we go into an organization and talk to the leaders about it and then talk to the employees about it, and they say, well, yeah, they say, that people are number one asset, but we just had a 400 person layoff. So do their actions match what they want?
Where's the alignment there?
That's right. Yeah. The alignment of the core values. And then that's creating the culture. Every company has a culture, whether they want it or not, whether they have a list of cultural items or values or not, they have a culture. It's the alignment between what the model looks like and what we want in the future that's most important. And that's where we step in and help them with that gap. How do we go from where you altruistically want to be with the values to here's the model that the current leaders are portraying now? That's the gap in between. And so we help them close that gap.
I think another thing is what an organization does with a high performing individual who does not exhibit the culture is, I think, one of the litmus tests of what your culture really is.
Can you give an example of that?
Oh, yeah. So if you have an individual who is maybe a really great sales leader, they're out there, they schmooze with the customers great, the customers love them, they're, closing big deals, but behind the scenes, they're treating their team very badly. They're not they're not building trust with people. They're withholding information and all of these things that could be going against their core values. What an executive team or leadership team does with that person says everything to me about whether or not their culture is real. It's like the test.
Yeah.
Because if you are willing to get rid of that person who's really good for business, but really bad for the team, then it means to me, your values mean something.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I worked for an organization who actually put that is what they would do in writing in a book that they put together to describe their culture and their values and mission and vision. And I remember reading that for the first time and thinking to myself, oh boy, you just put it in writing. One, good job. That is what you should do.
Yeah.
But two, let's see if it actually happens. And, it wasn't even a year later where they had to make a decision like that. And I said, okay, it's real.
True, yeah. Same thing for operations, not only sales, but across the board. You have a plant manager who is just hitting the numbers every month. Their customer numbers are great or whatever, but they don't treat people well. They push people, they swear at people, that kind of stuff. How does the leadership group, how do the executives handle that person? And if they're not willing to take that next step and say, you're not fitting our culture, then that tells you what the culture of the organization is. And so again, the gap between what they really want the culture to be and what the culture actually is, they have to have some action steps in there to make that happen. And so again, I think you can approach that from a variety of different ways. Terminating the person would be one, but also maybe learn, training. Maybe they don't know. I had a person in a class just the other day, had been manager for 40 years.
Wow.
And we were just taking them through basic management kind of training activities, how you hire, how you interview, some legal stuff went with that. And after we were finished, he said, I never knew any of that. I didn't even know that was out there, and that I had been interviewing hundreds of people. And I didn't even realize I was doing that. So some of it is just pure that they don't know. We haven't developed the leader into the position with the knowledge and the ability to do that. That's how their boss was. That's how they are. And that's the way they run the plant. So I think a lot of times we can intervene with some good training, some powerful training, and some knowledge so that they can say, I can still get my numbers, but now I can act and behave differently. Yeah.
Well,
that's what we're targeting.
I'm so glad you pointed that out, because what I'm not saying is, the person's a terrible person, just automatically get rid of them.
That's right.
Do what you should do to provide feedback, create awareness, put a plan in place, see if they're willing to get on board, all that stuff. In this particular instance, the individual wasn't willing. So, okay, you've made your choice. And the company, you could argue maybe the company lost some revenue, lost some opportunities, but, I like to say you never get to make a risk-free decision and a cost-free decision. You're going to pay the costs now with maybe some immediate lost revenue, or you're going to pay it down the road with a team that completely turns over and customers that get burned on something because this person ends up treating them the same way. And all of a sudden you've got a much bigger problem on hand. So pay the piper now, pay the piper later. You're going to pay the piper.
Well, and the interesting part about that is, you're gonna have some impact when this person leaves, but everybody else in the organization now breathes a sigh of relief, and then they're willing to come to work on Monday instead of calling off sick, right? So even though you may think you're losing money by getting rid of the person who's toxic or the person who's not treating people well, in reality, the rest of the organization goes, finally, now we can move forward. So oftentimes the bonus that you get out of better performance, better morale, people showing up, people willing to stay at the company outweighs that greatly. Yeah.
So I love what you said a few minutes ago about we don't know what we don't know. It sounds like almost instilling a level of curiosity in the leaders underneath you.
Yeah.
But I'm sure if you're listening to this podcast, you may find yourself in one of these situations that we're sharing as an example, or maybe you know someone who is, or maybe you're sparked a different situation that maybe you fall into in terms of leadership and living out your cultural values. What would you say are one or two simple things that leaders listening to this podcast could do this week to bring values into their daily conversations or decision making?
You know, a lot of the leaders that we work with, and certainly been my own experience in my career, is you have some sort of staff meeting, you have one-on-ones. Hopefully, you're doing one-on-one.
Yeah, that's right.
But you're having some sort of form. It could even be a stand-up meeting at the beginning of a shift in a plant or a warehouse. You know, look for those areas where you have some standard set opportunities to be in front of people.
Yeah.
And as the leader, make a conscious decision to pull out those values and say, hey, we're going to talk about this one this week or this one this month.
Yep.
And I've just got a couple of questions. You know, we were joking about ChatGPT right before getting on here. Any of those tools can give you some great questions. Type your value in there and say, hey, what are some questions I could ask my team and describe the team, sales team, marketing team, frontline supervisors about this value so that we can have a rich conversation about it. And I'm not talking about 45-minute conversation, just bringing it up regularly, have 3-minute discussion. At first, you may only get a few people. Maybe the extrovert's going to throw an idea out there or two, but over time, you're going to get, I think, more participation and interaction.
Well, and I sit on several nonprofit boards, and the first thing we do at the beginning of every meeting is read the mission statement. So why couldn't somebody in an organization open up a plant-wide meeting or a HR meeting or any kind of meeting and say, you know what, before we get started making that big decision we're going to do, here's our mission, blah, 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 and they read through it.
Not like a Pledge of Allegiance or something.
Well, that'd be all right.
A Pledge of Allegiance to this job.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but at least saying, here's what we're focused on. So when we make that decision, we know we're focused in the right area, or even core values. Like Nate said, the best plant manager I think that I ever saw that I worked with inside a company, he actually challenged his people every day, every time he would sit down with them, either one-on-one or when they do team meetings, he would say, okay, name one of our core values that's most important to you. And after first, it was slow. People didn't want to or whatever. But I tell you, after the first month of him doing that, when he stepped in front, somebody would say, sincerity or whatever it happened to be. And so again, the leader setting the model, setting the tone for, we're going to talk about this and we're going to focus on it. We're going to make sure that we're doing it. And I'll tell you one other quick story. Working with the cardboard manufacturing plant. I think I told this story on the webinar too. Working with a cardboard manufacturing plant, they had 26 OSHA violations a month. So that normal is like 1 point something or whatever, just horrible. And so one of his big values obviously was safety. So what he did is he went out on the floor and told, look, everybody's going to be safe. We're changing the culture. So, and here's how I'm going to change the culture. If you see me, the president of the company, come out on the floor and I don't have my safety material on, I will pull $20 out of my wallet and I will give it to you. And so they were like, yeah, sure, whatever. So what he would do is he would take customers on tours and he'd get them all geared up. But then when he went out, he'd take his safety glasses off his eyes and put it on his helmet. And then he would walk out with a customer. So you got hourly employees looking at him with a customer, important person standing there. And are they willing to step up and do that? He said the first time it ever happened, he said it took a couple of times before people actually was like, oh, wait a minute, he doesn't safety glasses. The first time it happened, he said the guy kind of sheepishly walked up to him and whispered to him, you don't have your safety glasses on, kind of thing. He pulled his wallet out right in front of the customer, pulled a $20 bill out and handed it to him. And so then after that, of course, everybody in the plant was watching this go on. And so after that, every time he came out on the floor, it was like a swarm. They were ready for him. Mm-hmm. But what happened is they went from 26 a month down to 0 for at least the next 7 months. And then when they did have one, everybody was upset. Previously, they didn't care. And so so oftentimes just living out your own value, living the value yourself and saying, look, this is important to me. In fact, it's important to me. I'm willing to pull money out of my pocket to pay you.
So being that example.
Being the example. But even going farther than that and setting it up so that he's proving a point, right? He didn't accidentally not put his glasses on. He purposely put them on his helmet to demonstrate that this is how important it is to me. And so, he said he ended up spending $120 before he actually made the change and that kind of stuff, but it happened. And so that for me is the implementation of something that I care about as a leader. That's a value for the corporation as well. And then me taking positive action, make that happen.
$120. I'm not sure I heard of an OSHA violation of $120.
No, it's a lot more than
it's $120 you ever spent.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we talked a few minutes ago about toxic people, and if they're not aligning with your culture, it's actually better for the culture to possibly consider releasing them.
Yeah.
What other roadblocks or common pushbacks can leaders expect when trying to realign their culture or live it out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And oftentimes it's all about productivity because, if you're in a manufacturing environment or even in an accounting firm, it's all about serving the customer. We got to get the customer, right? And so people fall into that panic mode. And I think a lot of times what happens is we're like, well, I understand that he yelled at you this time, but he was under a lot of pressure. He had to get this out by then. And so it's okay. Right. And so slowly but surely what happens is we slip back and slip back and slip back. And so we don't maintain our core values, or we don't maintain the way that the culture wants to be. And so again, it's back to consistency, like Nate talked about, and it's about making sure that when those things come up, when there's a big pressure and it's a time thing and we've got to make a decision on this. And so, okay, well, we're going to allow this person to holler at this person because, he was really busy. We can't, right? We have to stop and go back and say, okay, let's talk about that for a few minutes because that didn't match our values. That didn't hit where we needed it to be. So how are we going to handle this differently? So oftentimes it comes from there. Or people will say, hey, I'm just getting my numbers. You hired me to do a job. I'm doing a job. And unfortunately you can't let that happen. And that's kind of old school a little bit. I don't think it happens as much today as it used to, but it still happens where people say, you hired me to do a job. And so I'm doing a job. I'll tell you one more quick story. Sorry, I got lots of stories.
You got stories, bring them out.
I'm sitting with a group of forklift drivers, and they're introducing themselves. And when I get to the last person, Bobby, he said, well, I don't really usually do this thing because I don't really like people. I don't deal with people very much. When I wake up in the morning, first words out of my mouth is a cuss word. And so I just don't like dealing with people. And he said, but I'm the best forklift driver in this plant. Guarantee it. You ask anybody, I'm the best. And so I said, all right, team, what do you think? Is Bobby the best forklift driver in the plant? And they're all shaking their head. Yeah, he's probably the best forklift driver. I get it. How many of you want to work with him? Raise your hand. Not one. Ooh. So I turned back to Bobby and said, do you see that? So best forklift driver in the plant, nobody wants to work with you. And he went, nobody? I said, I didn't get any hands. And he was like, oh. I said, do you have to work with these people? Do they give you things? Do you give them things? Well, yeah, that's what, yeah. And so sometimes, again, it's that I get so embroiled in myself that I don't get that feedback. I don't understand that this is the impact I'm having on other people. And sometimes you just have to stop them and say, hang on just a minute. Yeah. Even though you're the best forklift driver, you're the best welder, you're the best whatever. How are you interrelating with the people that you work with every day? How's that impacting them? If you don't work with those people, what does that mean? Kind of thing. So yeah. It's very important.
So those are, values are largely intended to shape how you relate to other people. Right. And so in that case, he's good at the technical side of his job, but maybe not necessarily at the behavioral side of the job. And I think one of the things that can help in organizations is elevating both as critical. And that's essentially the essence of the story I told earlier about getting rid of the individual who had great numbers, but were treating people poorly. So when we talk to organizations about their performance process, right? Okay, people know what they're supposed to deliver. You're supposed to fill the truck in this amount of time or whatever as a forklift driver. But you're also supposed to act this way. And so I think best practice is to say, you're going to get 50% of your credit for doing your job, whatever that description is, and 50% of your credit's going to come from the way you interact with other people. And so now you've elevated the values to equal with job performance. and that your overall performance rating actually includes both, I think that can start helping shape in people's minds that this is important. Because I would argue best forklift driver, maybe, but not best forklift employee if you can't work with other people, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And the other thing I'd take us back on this question of where's the resistance coming from, I'll go back to what we always hear in our training classes is, has my boss been through this class?
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I know some people that need, this stuff, right? And so I'm just going to keep harping on leaders as a linchpin for your culture.
Yeah.
You have to understand the impact of the behavior of leaders. So what should leaders expect from pushback is if their behavior or other leaders' behavior is not aligned, then you're going to get pushback. Somebody's going to call it out, and they should.
Yeah, absolutely.
They should. And once they do, what you do with that is really, really important.
And that's where expectation setting comes in from leadership. I talk a lot of times with leaders, and I said, look, you are the leader, so you set the expectation. I was talking to a group the other day about conflict, and I said, so do you have conflict on your team? They're like, oh, yeah, we got people who fight all the time. I said, so it must be an expectation that you allow conflict on your team. And they're like, no, we don't allow that. I said, sounds like it does.
Yeah.
I said, when was the last time you sat them down in a meeting and said, here is my expectation of how we handle conflict. And this is how we're going to do it from now on our team. This is how we handle conflict. So it's really no difference because it's saying, here's how you're going to treat each other. Here's how you're going to operate a forklift. Here's how you're going to do that. So I think oftentimes leaders forget that they're responsible for setting expectation, and that when something goes on, they just can't ignore it and hope it goes away. If they don't have the skills to handle it, they have to set those expectations up front and say, this is the way we're going to treat your fellow coworker. And if you don't, it's going to be no different than if you didn't hit your numbers or you didn't, clock in on time or whatever it happens to be. And having being them willing to have those difficult or challenging conversations with their employees. And I think that's one of the roadblocks is, well, I don't want to upset these people by telling them that they're not behaving the right way. I don't even know how to do that. And so again, helping them through training, giving them models of how they can give feedback and how they can handle conflict differently is something we do. And I think it helps a lot of times because now I have a way that I can handle that conflict. Oh, Jimmy said I can set some expectations, do that. And then when I do get conflict, here's how I handle it. It helps me a lot as a leader because now I know what to do.
Oh, yeah. No, it's really great. So we just talked through a couple examples of how misaligned values led to major issues, but what can leaders walk away with from that? Like if you were to give it like here are the top 3 things you could do, what would that be?
Well, I would say, I don't know if I can get all 3, so I'm going to need Jimmy to weigh in.
Yeah.
But, I think I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier, just embed values in your performance process. That should be a major takeaway.
Yeah. Hit them in the pocketbook.
Yeah.
Because that's when they pay attention.
That's right.
Yeah.
To Jimmy's point, hopefully your performance process is tied to compensation somehow, right?
Yeah.
So the better you perform, the better you get compensated. And when you start to elevate values to that level, it gets a little more attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's one. And it's not just that. I know Jimmy talked a lot about talking about your values in a lot of different ways, but so your performance process for sure, but even back it up and say, well, how do you talk about your values before they're even an employee of yours? Do people understand? Is it embedded in the recruitment materials and how you talk about what it's like to work in your organization? Right. And then also when you're interviewing them, are you asking questions about how they think about these values
or what their values are?
That's
and
right.
do they align?
Yeah, that even goes back to, we talk a lot about EVPs and the employer value propositions in your employer brand.
That's right.
Making sure you're attracting the right people and repelling those that don't align with your values.
So I would say number 2 is what we talked about previously. Find your mission statement and memorize it. Okay. Yeah. Or at least write it down on a piece of paper and stick it in front of your computer or whatever. And same thing for the values. Understand what your 5 or 6 values are, and then write a definition. Either go to human resources if they have one, or create one of your own so you can talk to your team about it and maybe get their input on, well, how do you define integrity? What does that mean to you guys? So having that mission statement so that it's in my head head when I'm making decisions, bringing it up at team meetings, starting off that way when you're going to talk to a group of people, and then talking about the core values. What does integrity really mean? What does transparency really mean? What does, glad to be here really mean? And so when you're talking about those things, it gives people an idea of, oh, that's a value that I have as well. I like to show up for work on time, and I'm glad to be here. So that's something the company supports, right? So then I get alignment. And when I have that alignment, then people don't show up just for a paycheck. They show up to be that's their career. They show up to support the organization so that the organization supports them. It's that mutualness that happens. And so I think that's probably, for me, number 2 is memorize that mission statement and get those core values down so that you can explain to somebody who's new, a new hire, or even another employee who's been there for 30 years who doesn't know them, what exactly they mean. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. What about number 3?
So I would say, I don't know if it's necessarily all leaders' responsibility, but certainly someone in the organization needs to take responsibility. And I'll take it back to what you said, Nick, the employer value proposition.
Yeah.
How do you share the story of what's important to your organization in social media, on videos? I know, Nick, you work with a lot of organizations to build video content for them to tell that story. How is that showing up in just the way the organization shows up in the community? And somebody's got to take charge of that work. A lot of times it's HR, sometimes it's communications, and sometimes it should be a combination of a number of people, but at least somebody telling that story and being very intentional about it. Once you put it out there, though, the warning is you got to live up to it, right? Because people will spot that hypocrisy a mile away if they think if you say you're one thing and then you demonstrate something else. So there's a little bit of a warning there. When you're ready, though,
that's right,
somebody's got to take the reins.
And then I'll add to that, is number 3 as well, is that I need to spend time in my organization observing what's really going on. Right. I need to watch people. I need to watch how they interact. I need to be an observer and kind of curious about, well, how do you feel about that? How's your job going? So oftentimes I think executives pull themselves away from that interaction with the people who are actually doing the work, in the environment, and they shouldn't. So they've got to step back into that role to say, this is what we say we are. What's really going on? How's it really working out there? And so then they can see the gap and say, oh, well, here's an area where we need to work on. Or they can say, wow, yeah, that's what we said, and that's what's happening, which is really cool to watch. So I think that's a combination with the third part that Nate said, which was be an observer of that and make sure that you can see it happening in reality, not only to your customers and the public out there, but also to the people who work there.
Yeah. No, that's so great. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about, even with your EVP. We're going to have to do another podcast episode just on that right there.
The part 3 coming in.
Yeah, part 3, yeah.
So in terms of today's conversation in building stronger core values and aligning your organization with it, what do you hope our listeners will do differently after hearing today's conversation? What's the takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I know my takeaway. I'm sitting here thinking, okay, it's one thing to tell people all these things, but we got a company to run too.
That's right.
And so I think my own takeaway is to think about and reflect on how to bring the values to life more for my team. We live and swim in the OD and training consulting space, and I would say we've got areas to improve on related to this. So maybe in our staff meetings, we needed to just talk more about these values and our mission. I think we do talk about them, but we also get very wrapped up in the latest crisis, the next project that we're on, and whatever. And before you know it, the hour and a half is gone, and it's like we haven't talked about any of this foundational DNA stuff about who we are. So I don't know if that should be what people take away, but that's what I'm taking away.
That's
really great.
Yeah, I think that's good. Well, and I think the other thing that people can take away from this conversation is that it's okay. It's okay if your organization is not 100% following all your missions and values, and that you're not talking about it all the time. That it's okay, that it's not a bad place to be. But then one step farther, let's do something about it. As a leader, I get so wrapped up sometimes in what I'm doing and my emails and all the projects I got going and that kind of stuff that I don't take a step back and say, I need to do something and then take action to do it. So get out of my office and go walk on the, in the area where people are actually doing the work, whether it's production floor or an office, doesn't matter. Talk to people about missions and values. How's it going for you? Are we following our mission or values? So take some kind of action so that you can see that yes, we're doing better than I thought, and maybe here's some areas where we can improve it at the same time. But don't just let this sit. I mean, the action I'd really want them to take is to do something with it. Start having a meeting with mission statements. Start talking about the core values that are most important to you, and telling that story to people, and maybe even giving them examples. Hey, a customer called the other day, and this is the way that the person handled it. Man, it really demonstrated that they're customer focused, or that they're caring, or whatever the value happens to be. And then the last piece that I think would be important is, how about recognizing when people are doing this well? When I got an employee out, maybe they're a machinist or a welder, and they're out there, and when I talk to their fellow coworkers, they're like, wow, yeah, Bob's always listening to us, and Bob's always great, man. He's a great team member. Let's highlight that, right? Too many times I think we look at the negative side of somebody that's not doing it, and we don't spend enough time with those giving Bob a reward for being a great team member, and be specific. So if teamwork is something that you're valued, then that's what you give them the reward for. We did a whole entire program at a company I worked with previously, where online you could actually give people badges. And it was 5 different categories. It was safety, and there was, I don't remember, integrity, and some other ones, our core values basically. And you could give them badges. And when they got to a certain level of, they had got 10 badges, well, then they got to go to human resources and pick out a prize. And so it was a big deal when they got a chance to go to human resources, because it was like, wow, 10 times this person demonstrated. And most of the time it was multiples that they did. It just wasn't one over and over again. It was one and then 2 or 3 others. And so making a big deal about it when people actually hit our values and actually demonstrate, model for us what it looks like. Because again, if Nate's getting rewarded all the time for his great behavior and I haven't gotten anything yet, I may say, well, gee, maybe I should do something. And so again, it's going to push me in the direction of following that. Not everybody, but a large percentage of people hopefully would say, I'd like to get that as well. And so they start doing things. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this was a great conversation. And if you heard anything in today's conversation that you feel like your organization could benefit from, whether it's, defining your mission, vision, and values, or aligning your core values with your culture, or maybe it's even developing an EVP or auditing your current employees on how they feel about your company, or maybe it's even sending this podcast to your boss secretly, just let us know and I'll shoot it over to him. We want to help you. Frontline, we care about developing people, inspiring growth, and unlocking potential. And join us at frontline.com. Subscribe to this podcast. Watch our webinars that we shared. We definitely want to connect with you in any way that you need connecting with. So thanks so much, Nathan.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jimmy.
You're quite welcome.
We're going to see you next time on The Frontline.